You should make Aviva a co-host and he can mute and unmute people.
Okay, well, we can do that, I think. Or I can make her a host, but not a co-host, apparently.
That's okay.
Okay,
That's
take it
okay.
away.
Okay. Good evening. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight. We on the Adult Education Committee of B'nai Yeshurun are very, very proud to present tonight's lecturer. I personally am especially honored since Dr. Brill has been my professor and mentor in Jewish philosophy and many other things for almost 20 years. As you can see from Dr. Brill's bio, he is a renowned scholar with expansive knowledge.
Yeah, I know, Corinne. Just
and teaching experience, and is also a prolific author. Dr. Brill's areas of expertise include Chassidut and Kabbalah, as well as interfaith dialogue.
no, Corinne.
In his engagement in interfaith dialogue, Dr. Brill makes a true Kiddush Hashem, representing truths of Judaism to other religious leaders who seek to understand. Dr. Brill also has a keen sense of listening and interpreting sentiments shared from other religious leaders, and in an attempt to understand them, invites us to partake in this process and helps us to better understand our own Jewish identities. Tonight, Dr. Brill will speak about his sabbatical year in India and the meaning that he discovered in his Hindu encounters. And so really, it is a tremendous, tremendous personal and professional and community-wide honor, I guess, to introduce Dr. Alan Brill to you. So please, Dr. Brill.
Thank you, Aviva. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to speak to B'nai Yeshurun. And so I'm going to get started by saying that already it's quite a while already. 2013-14, I spent a sabbatical year teaching in India. I had a Fulbright fellowship from the State Department where I taught at Benares Hindu University in Varanasi, and I taught a course in Judaism, and I taught a course in Western religion. Now, understand that Judaism is very exotic for them. From their point of view, even the instructor had barely heard of the Talmud. But beyond that, they also didn't know that we don't do sacrifices anymore, because one of the few Jewish books they have, please everybody can mute themselves just because I'm getting background noises, is one of the few Jewish books they have is the Chumash, and they assume that Jews are still giving sacrifices like in Leviticus. And then when I say Jews are not in Teaneck giving sacrifices, the next thing they say is, oh, your 19th century reformers got rid of it, and it's all very recent. I start with that because that's important, that almost anything you know about Hinduism is equally inaccurate and equally out of date. Almost any generalization, stereotype, anything that you're even going to find in a college survey of religion book from 30 years ago or on Google is not correct. Jews are not practicing Leviticus, and Hindus are not practicing the book of the Vedas that you might have read in a college course. Okay, they're not practicing several thousand-year-old books. They're practicing very modern versions. We also have two very different histories. So quite a few Indians will ask me after they find out I'm Jewish is, what do I think of Hitler? Because they cannot find Europe on a map. They certainly can't find Russia, Poland, Germany on a map. As much as most of you, unless you fought in the Eastern Front, cannot find the Japanese war through Indochina and Burma. You would not exactly know all the details of it. So even the histories are quite different. Now, Hinduism is actually a variety of separate religions that we just, for whatever reason in the West, call Hinduism, and Hinduism just means the religions of India. Hindu means India, the Indus Valley. India is 1.2 billion people, probably the most populous country on earth. Any small little break-off sect, any break-off congregation has more members than there are Jews in the world. So bear that in mind, that there are no generalizations that work well. The country has over 19 official languages. It's at least broken down into several religions of Vaishnavites, Shaivites, Smarta. And within those, there are many, many subdivisions. And North and South have very different versions of it. So if you have any Hindu colleagues at work, those from Northern India last week celebrated Mahashivarani, and those from Southern India celebrated Pongal. Same day, two different festivals. Okay, it's that amount of diversity. But let's talk a little bit, put it in Jewish terms to help you move along before we get down to some other things. When Jeroboam, when Yerovam put up the golden calves in Beit El and Dan, that was seen as a sin because you took away from the sanctuary in Yerushalayim. In India, they would say that's a great thing because look, you are now bringing God and the temples to more and more people. And in fact, the third president of India, the author Ramakrishnan, actually wrote that he doesn't understand Yerovam because in India, it's such a big country in so many languages. The only thing that makes sense is to keep putting up lots and lots of temples. And if you put up lots and lots of temples, they diverge from each other in different practices. India is also different than Judaism in that all those things forbidden in Devarim. Don't put up pillars, don't worship the stars. In India, all that is seen as okay. Why? Because the people will learn. Where Judaism said you've got to do away with these things, the Indian religion says they're also bad, but for most people, they say that's all they can handle and we're going to let them do it. So unlike the book of Bereshit, where Avraham and Yaakov put up matzevot, they put up pillars, and that was okay in Bereshit. And as the Sifri notices, it's okay in Bereshit, it's not okay in Devarim. In India, it becomes, it's okay, still okay now, but if you're an educated person, it's not okay anymore. But they leave it to still do it to this day. When you get to Eliyahu on Har Carmel, when he's having a showdown with the priest of Baal, if this was India, Eliyahu would have just said, as if it was possible, he would have quoted the book of Malachi. And if you know the Pasuk 111, it says, my name will be great among the nations from when the sun rises to where it sets. In every place that people offer incense or offerings, it'll be brought in my name because my name is great among the nations. Meaning we all worship one God. Why can't we just get along with each other? Meaning India is always going to take the turn. And even when there were many, many religions, it was going to take the turn and say we're really all the same. Let's now take it to a story that everybody knows, the story of Abraham destroying the idols in his father Terach's shop. Okay, very famous story, goes back to Second Temple times, in which Terach was an idol maker, and that he puts Abraham in charge of the store one day. And when he comes back, Terach finds all the idols broken, except for one, the biggest, in which Abraham put the axe in the biggest idol's hand and says he broke all the other ones. And if this was a Hindu version of the story, it would come out very differently than our Midrashic story. If this was India, Terach would have said to Abraham, Abraham, are you a moron? Why did you destroy the statues? Don't you know we need images to bring the divine to mind? We need a representation Without some representation, we can't worship. And Avraham would have said, but there's only one immaterial God. Terach would have said, but we live in a sensory material world. That's why the Torah will later give us the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and also God will give us physical commandments. So that's why we have sensory items in order to come to God. And Avraham would have said, but you think they're actually alive. Terach would have said, give me a break. Don't you know they're only a way to focus during prayer? And certainly when they're non-consecrated, they're nothing but stone. And Terach would have said, do you think the cherubs in the tabernacle move? Do the Kruvim move in the Mishkan? Avraham would have said, yes. The Kruvim turn to each other and away from each other. Terach would have said, boy, are you anthropomorphic. Maybe you should read the Guide of the Perplexed, or maybe Shankara's Brahma Sutra. And Avraham would have said, but I see all those thousands of plaster and clay little idols. Aren't you worshiping them? Terach would have repeated, don't you understand already? We use them for a specific purpose, and we're done. We leave them specifically out in the rain when we're done to show they have no intrinsic holiness. And that's why we also change them regularly. In fact, you treat religious objects like tefillin in a more intrinsic manner. And Avraham would have said, but a woman came and said she brought them food to eat, and therefore they eat. Terach would have said, no, she just said she's bringing them an offering to show her love. If you're in a foreign country, please assume that they're not naive and they're as sophisticated as you are. And Avraham would have said, but I discovered the God of heaven and earth, and everyone else is primitive and literal. And Terach would have answered, I can't wait till you're out of adolescence. But if God ever tells you to offer his son, think about what the word offering means. With that, to set us up, let's now get to the Hindu part. So my actual discovery of Hinduism started before I got on the plane. All the Fulbright scholars, we met in a Manhattan restaurant to meet each other. And before, for some reason, all the non-Jews from the Midwest got there first, and the Jews and Hindus got there like 20 minutes later. But for some reason, the Midwesterners all ordered first, not realizing that most of the rest of us are not going to eat whatever meat and whatever else they ordered. But it immediately became a discussion of, for example, is fish meat or not? So, for example, for Jews, fish is not meat. And for Bengalis, fish is not meat. But for Gujaratis, fish is meat. And we got a discussion about how do you think about objects. We then got into a whole discussion about mushrooms. Because, for example, there are a number of Bengali Hindus there. They won't eat the mushrooms because they're not a vegetable. Now, for Jews, they'll eat mushrooms, but you know the blessing on mushroom is a shahakol, not a hadama, because it's not really a vegetable. Okay, it's a parasite, it's a fungus, whatever you want to call it. That sort of thinking about things is what Judaism and Hinduism shares in common. And I was officially at Benares Hindu University, which was a modern Orthodox version of Hindu University. So it was a co-ed university. You know, people kissed their books when they were done using them. The overly pious, when they would kiss everything when they're done, would kiss the dictionaries too. It was, since it was co-ed, they would, when they put on plays, what they had to do is that the male lead in the play, who had to hold the hand of the female lead, was given to another woman because they had to make sure not to touch. And the men were given parts that they didn't have to touch any women. And then afterwards, the female students had to go to the female dean to get their scarf and flower as a gift, and the male students to the male dean, and there'd be a whole thing if you went to the wrong line. But no, if it was a traditional school, it would have not been co-ed. If it was a secular school, there would have been no problem. But there was this immediate recognition of having to play this game of being a co-ed school and still having to follow the rules. Or something on campus, there were two ice cream stands, vegetarian and strictly vegetarian. Well, in some way, one was ordinary and one was specialist vegetarian. And I asked, what was the difference between the two? And the answer is the special one did not use sprinkles because sprinkles use resinous glaze, unlike the regular vegetarian one that relied on the leniencies to use sprinkles that come from an animal-derived resinous glaze. And that boils down to a debate between various rabbis in America also, whether you could use resinous glaze sprinkles. I mean, the whole discussions are ones that Jews should know very much about. Now, when I look at Hinduism, I'm not looking at the colorful people that you see in the street. They don't represent Hinduism for my discussion. The same way most of you have rabbis, congregations, Rosh Yeshiva, teachers, you don't consider the person who sits at the Kotel who is selling you red bindles to be the authority on Judaism. You don't assume that the person who is begging and maybe wearing some interesting Yerushalmi gown is the true authority and the true source. I assume the same thing about Hinduism. It means all the learned Brahmins, the Pandits, who are coming in with their books and their PowerPoints and all of the Hindu classics on a flash drive are my authorities for Hinduism, not the colorful people you tend to take pictures with in the street. They tend to not know as much the same way like the Jewish situation. Now, this is not the first time Jews have learned about Hinduism. Know that for the Middle Ages, there was a solid shelf of Hindu books that were translated from Hindu languages into Persian, from Persian into Arabic and Judeo-Arabic. So therefore, and a lot of them are ascribed to the Ibn Ezra, a lot of the things we know, like the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita, were available to medieval Spanish Rishonim. They had copies of them. When you go looking for it, you will see the quotes. But the one thing to understand, and this is going to play an important role going forward, Muslims and Jews translated the word diva as angels, as malach or malakaya, not as gods. When medieval Muslims and Jews saw the divas, they said these are angels, these are intermediaries. They never translated it as gods. So the reception of it was quite different. So for example, Sadyagon, if you open up a full version of Sadyagon, you will find that he quotes the Brahmins and he quotes them correctly. Sadyagon had full access to various Brahmin ideas in the 10th century. And you'll find it in, people know the Indian quotes in the Ibn Ezra and Meiri and elsewhere. But I want to jump ahead to the age of exploration. Rabbi Menashe ben Israel in 17th century Amsterdam, the time of the East India Company, and you know Jews were actively involved in the East and West India Companies, which is why Jews were permitted to settle in New York or in Indonesia or elsewhere, is when he read the books that came from the missionaries that made fun of the Indian religions, saying that they were just superstition, absurdity, follies, and many gods. Menashe ben Israel said no. He actually quoted the verse from Malachi and said, anybody who makes an offering is worshiping me. And Menashe ben Israel is the one who actually created that famous story that Abraham gave the Pelagshim the religions of the East. Okay, then gets quoted by Aryeh Kaplan and many others. But Menashe ben Israel is the one who created that story. The religions of the East are really gifts from Abraham, and we're all worshiping one God. I don't have the time to go into, but you should know that when the sacred books of the East came out in the beginning of the 20th century, they got all sorts of reviews by rabbinic figures trying to connect them to Judaism, whether the Mizrahi school in Amsterdam or a Orthodox rabbi in Baltimore wrote book reviews of the sacred books of the East, trying to connect it to Judaism. But what Judaism and Hinduism really met each other was now 17 years ago, when the Orthodox Jewish community discovered that sheitel hair at the time predominantly came from the temples in India. There became an immediate wake up in terms of trying to figure out what that could possibly mean. And I was one of the minor border crossers, and myself and a few other people were called the day before the pandemonium broke out to say, what are they doing? But what all of us have matching stories is when we tried to explain to them what is Hinduism, the answer basically became, how does this fit into the worship of Merkulis in the Talmud? Meaning there really wasn't any ability for our people at the other end of the phone to understand that there are actually religions out there in the world. Everything had to be what's known in the Talmud, and therefore the only religions you knew were the Greco-Roman ones. So there was very little way for us to explain what was going on. In the end, it all worked out. I mean, even though it now mainly comes from China, but in the end, they didn't realize how many languages there were. They didn't really understand the whole process. Now there have been many trips to India, and people have a better sense of it. 3 years later, in 2007, is the first Hindu-Jewish summit between rabbis, including the chief rabbinate of Israel, and leaders of Hinduism. In 2007, they met in Delhi. In 2008, they met in Yerushalayim. And 2009, they met in New York. So I was part of the New York meeting. And the rabbis, which included, once again, rabbis included from the chief rabbinate in Israel and assorted other figures, met in India. They toured temple complexes, and they met again in Jerusalem in 2008. And in 2008, the rabbinate signed on to a statement that said the participants, both Hindu and Jewish, reaffirm their commitment to deepening the bilateral relationship predicated on the recognition of one supreme being, creator and guide of the cosmos, shared values, and similar historic experiences. It is recognized that the one supreme being, both in its formless and manifest aspects, has been worshipped by the Hindus over the millennia. This does not mean that the Hindus worship gods or idols. The Hindus relate to only one supreme being when he or she prays to a particular manifestation. So the chief rabbinate signed on to that already. If some of you know, Rabbi Daniel Sperber is working on a very long book showing that it's not multiple gods or avodah zarah, but that it's all a form of a monotheism. He's been working on this book for 14 years already. I've been reading successive drafts of it, but he, is the one who's going to write the official first draft. But right now, there are a lot of Dayanim who are dealing with it, even though they haven't published yet, because there is so much action back and forth in an age of globalization. So let's go to my stay, my journey. So I came there in the fall, and in the fall is the Hindu Festival of Lights, Diwali. And I took a nighttime boat ride on the Ganges River in order to watch the activity of them lighting lights along the shore. And in the boat was a mixed group of Sanskrit scholars who live in Varanasi. And the other half were all sorts of visiting scholars from America and Europe. And they were explaining everything to us as we went down on the river watching it. And they took us past the tourist sites down to see the more authentic parts. We're in the moonlight, watching this display, watching the priests who are now lifting up these oil lamps, waving them because it's a festival of the lights. And at some point, I turned to one of the scholars and I said, what happens if they make a mistake? What if they drop it? What if one of the lights go out? Now, the Christian scholar who was sitting next to me basically said, don't make fun, you're being ridiculous. While the Hindu scholar said, no, these are very good questions. And first of all, it makes a distinction whether the mistake was intentional or it was unintentional. Was the lamp set up properly to start with? Was it lit properly and then it went out, or it wasn't set up to start with that way? Because these lamps have to have exactly 51 or 101 flames. The gestures are a certain direction. You light them in a clear sequence. Now, none of this exists within Catholicism, for example. If you make a mistake in the Mass, you just continue. If you drop something, you just continue. There is no sense of exact ritual. For Hinduism, like Judaism, every gesture is the same. I mean, you have to worry about. So too, you have to worry about that everybody has to be pure. So Judaism and Hinduism has the same list of impurities, not because of any influence, but because the body only makes a certain amount of fluids. So too, Judaism and Hinduism could have a discussion about feces and cow droppings in bathrooms and the questions of when you can pray and not pray, because of that exactitude of ritual. Both of them distinguish, and I'm not going to go into here, for example, between a animal that died naturally versus one that is torn apart. They also worry about intention, and that every Hindu ritual has to have a proper intention. Now, that term for intention is called Tantra. Tantra and Tantric is not what you think it means. It has nothing to do with esoteric sex rites or anything that the New Age makes it into. Tantra literally means weave, that you have to weave together the mind and the action and the mind, the action and the kavanah. In Rav Soloveitchik's terms, the masa and the kiyum, the doing it and the fulfillment of its effect on you. That's what a tantra is. And so therefore, Hindu ritual is very much about doing things exactly with the right intention. And there are actually over 60 tractates of a literature called the Agamic literature, which tells you how to do the ritual. Now that literature is almost, very little of it is available in English translation. So whatever you've seen about English translations about Hindu ritual, like the Dharma Shastras, are not really reflective of the full gamut of actually how they decide how to do things ritually. And this literature was written from the 2nd to the 10th century, very coextensive with the Talmud. And within this literature, what you're doing is you are connecting up to the divine realm. So the shortest form of connecting to the divine realm is when they say this ritual is for the sake of unifying Shiva and Shakti, two divine principles, male and female. Not much different than the Kabbalist who says, L'shem yichud kudshabrichu v'shchinte. That sort of intentionality before you do it. But the biggest thing I learned in India is that whatever Hinduism is taught in America, it's not the way Hindus learn Hinduism. From their point of view, remember, they still think we give sacrifices like Vayikra. From their point of view, there are 6 schools of Indian philosophy, and everybody learns all 6 of them starting in junior high school. The first one is called Nyaya, and that is the rational scholasticism, which is very similar to Sadhyagon and Maimonides. It's going to be the cosmological argument for God, the teleological argument for God. It's monotheistic, it's rational, and it's very similar to our own positions. School number two, Yossi, you've switched me to make you're the center screen rather than me.
How do I switch it back?
What?
How do I switch it back?
It should be speaker view or something.
You have to unpin yourself, and then you want to highlight the speaker.
Okay, you do that while I talk. The second school is called Mimamsa. Now, Mimamsa is the legal system.
In move spotlight.
Wait, don't, but the legal system is how you read text to derive law. So for those who do the principles of Rabbi Yishmael, this is how you derive law. Mimamsa is very similar in that, for example, if you have a klal uprat, a general law followed by a specific law in the Bible, the halacha says you go by the specific law. They have the similar principles, but understand that that's how they read the Vedas. They don't read the Vedas about many gods or about ancient times or horse sacrifices. They read it solely as a way to learn how to do their modern ritual. That's how they are reading it, as an indication of how the modern ritual gets done. Now, there's a whole school right now. There's a half a dozen people doing dissertations and books comparing Mimamsa to Halacha right now. There's actually an article in the Duke Law Review comparing Rav Soloveitchik to the Mimamsa in terms of what the legal thinking is. And you discover that for most Hindus who are scholars, who are Brahmins, that's how they're going about thinking about things. Not whatever exotic stuff you think about. So too, when you think about exotic things, all the statues that you see in museums or on the front pages of textbooks are decorative. The most famous example is the dancing Shiva, the Shiva with many arms that's dancing. That is a decorative sculpture. In fact, if you're actually a Shaivite, you only worship a simple pillar, a simple stone. And therefore, if you're out west in America, they tend to be pieces of petrified wood or crystallized quartz. If you're more old time, it could be a solid pillar, like we know from Bereshit. But all those dancing images are not the ones that are actually worshipped. It's the same way if, like, what if someone were to do a museum exhibit in India and we were to show a copy of the golden calf, to show a copy of the Kruvim, to show a copy of the bird's head Haggadahs, to show a copy of the Polish synagogue lions, and say these are the Jewish gods. We have a way of overly exoticizing rather than actually asking what they worship and what they don't worship. So moving on. But in India, There's very little sacrifice anymore, but in Nepal, they still do sacrifice as part of the law because the reform movements never hit Nepal. And a lot of Jews from Israel are fascinated to watch it because you hear so much about sacrifice and you never actually get to see it. Now, I was actually visiting a UNESCO site that unfortunately got mainly destroyed in a earthquake, and I smelled something terrible down an alley. So of course, being me, I had to walk down the alley to see what it was. And I saw a bunch of men in their holiday finest. They were sitting there and they were watching their assistant blowtorch an animal. It took about a minute for me to realize that what I'm watching is the cooking of a sacrifice. And if I sat down with them, they were going to expect me to take a piece because they were counting me in their number. So I quickly hightailed it out there saying, I've got to catch my car service. It's going to take me away. But you do find out that, for example, when Jews, if you think about slaughtering, whether in the temple or for our kashrut, it has to be back and forth, holich and heavy. And if you go straight down, it's no good. Hindus are the exact opposite. It's only good if you go straight down, but if you go back and forth, it can't be used. Now, we're not the same, but the sort of discussions you could have, not just about, impurity, intentionality, ritual, even, the basics of how knives work and how you slaughter things become very similar. Very similar in both. I actually made it up to the temple where the shaitel hair comes from. I made a specific point of it. And so what is the meaning of shaving the head? Know that that's a regular part of Indian life. It's not a sacrifice. So for example, in northern India, when you sit Shiva, meaning if you're mourning, you shave your head. Even if you're doing it for a grandparent or for an uncle, aunt, you shave a head, and that's norm of ritual life. In southern India, you do it for every festival before you take your bath. Now, when you go to the temple, you're supposed to shave your head as an act of devotion. If you are wealthy, you do it in a barber in your hotel. If you're a little wealthier, you do it, a little less wealthy, you do it in the barber in town, not directly in the hotel salon. If you're poor, they do it for free, and they actually give you a bar of soap and other things in order that you can then take a hot bath before going to the temple. And there was this incredible misunderstanding that this hair was a sacrifice, meaning the Haredi rabbis actually thought that the stainless steel hoppers and hampers were actually feeding the gods rather than just things that are being wheeled out. And they didn't understand that the entire process, that hair cutting is seen as an impure process rather than any form of worship. The other time that Hindus also cut their hair is they have for boys at the age of 2 or 3, they shave their head as a form of upshearing. So what do the modern Orthodox couples do for their girls? They're not going to shave their head because that's not what the law requires. So what they do is the northern Indians take a flight to a southern Indian temple and then shave everyone's head, including the little girl when she's 2 or 3. So she's just like her brothers. So therefore everybody gets to tonsure their head. It's that sort of roundabout for the modern Orthodox Hindu to make sure that the girl is not left out. Things that you really do understand coming from a Jewish perspective. So before I go on, just because at some point you're going to have other questions, So what about polytheism? I see all these imagery. I told you already that the medievals like Ibn Ezra and Saadia translate diva as angels, and the only thing that means God is Ishwara, which is a very different word. Though people who came up with, if you know, polytheism is not a halachic term. I can't repeat this enough. The word polytheism in no form appears in the Talmud or in the Rambam. The word is avodah zarah, foreign worship. We can't use any representation. We can't, even Yeravam ben Nevat, when he put up the golden calf, that was avodah zarah, even if you still think you're worshiping Yud Kei Vav Kei. Meaning, we can't use any imagery, but the word polytheism is not a Talmudic word. It's not in the Rambam. It's not in the Shulchan Aruch. We're not counting gods. We are counting, we're looking at representation, and representation is forbidden in halacha, regardless of even if you're worshiping Hashem. The source of the word polytheism is the 17th century Protestants, like John Toland, Seldane, David Hume, who basically said the primitive people of the earth, who they just discovered, have many imagery because they're worshiping the wind and the rain and the sun and the moon, and they can't understand one God, even though Hindus have had one God since our Second Temple times. Since 300 BCE, the Upanishads had one God. But Hume and Seldane and Toland assumed primitives have many gods. Level 2 is Jews and Catholics who have ritual. And only the true highest religion is the Protestants, who know you don't need any ritual or any objects or any temple or any place. So when you use the word polytheism, you are not using a Jewish word in any sense. This continued throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th century, in which Protestantism was seen as the highest religion. And in fact, Judaism was linked in many of these to Hinduism. So Sir William Jones, who wrote this 4-volume set, The Religion of the Hindus, said, look, they're just like the Hebrews. They are not good Christians. They use objects. They don't understand the true abstract God. And you're going to find that continuing actually all the way up till the, you still have it in the Golden Bow in the 1890s. You actually already, only from about the 1880s, you have Jews now being taken out of the pagan camp. And it's only 1951 when Frankfurt wrote his Ascent of Man. I mean, not Ascent of Man, when he wrote his, I forgot what he wrote. When Frankfurt wrote Ancient Man, then Jews are taken out of that category. But they understand it's really derogatory to us also. So how do you make sense of this? Is the difference really becomes is where Maimonides tells everybody in the beginning of Perek Bet of Avodah Zarah that you can't use representation of sun, moons, objects. Hindus will write in their commentaries, we're going to let the masses do it, even if we don't agree with it. More for our point is to look at Nachmanides. Nachmanides and his school, like the Rashba, both said that the idea that you only worship one God in the Aseret HaDibrot, in the Ten Commandments, only applied to Jews. Because what is our Aseret HaDibrot? The first one, I am the Lord your God who took you out for Egypt. Therefore, you shall have no other gods. But it says nothing about the other peoples of the world. You don't ever see the rest of Tanakh complaining that the other peoples of the world are worshiping Avodah Zarah. The only problem is when the Bnei Yisrael are worshiping the other gods. So the school of the Ramban and the Rashba assume that The other nations have no problems using representation. And certainly that's the way it's been understood by many in that sense. If for those who still have your Hertz Chumash, the Hertz Chumash actually still had in it, in the middle of the Devarim, that all the heathen nations of the world are really pointing to the supreme being, and they really are thinking about one God. Or Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who passed away last summer, said that from a Jewish point of view, Hinduism and the religions of Asia are certainly monotheistic enough by Jewish standards. They may not be following all the other prohibitions, but certainly the fact that they're monotheistic enough is enough to count, because they're no longer in that big category of not worshiping God. And you're going to see similar statements now in recently in Rav Henkin and others who follow that approach. And what about the folk, the common people? By any anthropologist, anyone who's looked at it says every Hindu knows there's one God, even if they can't articulate it, because that's just what they've been brought up to say. But the same way, you're taught one thing, and you're going to say it, and they all know that that's their doctrine. But bear in mind that, for example, in Indonesia, which is a Hinduism that grew up under Islam, because Indonesia is an Islamic country, the Hinduism in Indonesia is completely monotheistic. They worship one unknown God. They leave an empty chair and they put no image on it. And because in Indonesia, because they've got to fit into Islamic or else very similar to the halakhic categories, the Hindus say they worship one God. They worship they listen to the prophets. They follow scripture, and they believe in reward and punishment. And in that sense, there would be no Jewish problem. And therefore, there's a lot of parallels you can point out to this theism. So if any of you remember your copy of Eliezer Berkowitz's God, Man, and History, Eliezer Berkowitz at one point, he wants to describe the difference between the human person and the infinite divine and how we could possibly stand before God. Eliezer Berkowitz quotes the Bhagavad Gita, which says, suppose 1,000 suns were to arise tomorrow in the sky. God's infinite greatness remains beyond human understanding, creating an abyss between the human person and God. And Eliezer Berkowitz uses this as an example to understand how we should relate to God of Tanakh and Chazal. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein also uses as a good theistic example the Bhagavad Gita in several places about how it's all about your preparation and making yourself into a learned figure who can understand the true reality. And he also quotes the Bhagavad Gita as a regular theistic text that we can learn from. Okay. The one thing I've learned from Hinduism is to appreciate the role of sight more in Judaism. We tend to ignore, Hinduism is very much about seeing the temple, seeing the performance, and we kind of downplay how much the temple, it says, what's the phrase? It says, Olat Re'iyah. We're going up, it's Olat Regel, we're going up by foot, to Re'iyah, to see God in the temple at the Shlosh Regalim, in which God sees us and we see God. I have a greater appreciation for what that means. I have a greater appreciation for the Midrashim that says at Mount Sinai, everybody at Mount Sinai got a icon, and that word icon, that Greek word, is actually in the Hebrew text of the Psikta. Everybody got their own icon to see directly a vision of God. You know, we don't generally think about all that imagery, that iconography, which is in Midrash, meaning Greek Orthodox make the icons, but Midrash is filled with it. For example, when Midrash says that this biblical figure glowed, that's a halo. Greek Orthodox make the image, but we have it in Midrash saying this person glowed. Or when Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari says, when you say in the Amidah, Hamachazir Shechina Sel Tzion, that the Shechina should return to Zion, he says you should visualize the Shechina at that point. So I have a much bigger appreciation for it. And that's why, for example, right now in Israel, a lot of the more neo-Hasidic has their yeshivot are turning to things like Rav Kalanimus Kalman Shapiro and his B'nai Machshava Tova, who says you can visualize God if it will help you pray. So too Rav Kook in the Shmona Kvatzot says visualize God if it helps you pray, because what really counts is praying. Much greater appreciation for that, which I never had beforehand. Now to jump to modernization, and with this I'm going to be ending off. First of all, both, meaning India is now being affected by tourism, by globalization. Many of the old sites are being renewed because people are visiting them in tourism. A lot of the things you see, like the arti, the waving, the lamps, that almost any visitor to India will see, is done as a performance for tourism. And most of my Indian colleagues said, why am I going to see it? It's only being done for the tourists. I couldn't just say I'm a tourist, so I want to see it. But the answer is it's being done as a generic ritual that they can assume that everybody can understand. But here in New Jersey, you know, the biggest diaspora place of Hindus outside of the places that it came to be is here in Edison, New Jersey, and Island, New Jersey, that region. I assume some of you have coworkers who are Hindu, and know that when they build a congregation, understand that it now has a social hall for functions, know that it now has a Sunday school to teach language and to teach ritual, know that it's got a men's club, a sisterhood. Understand that New Jersey Hindu congregations work very much like a Jewish congregation, but they've even changed for New Jersey. For example, if you down in southern New Jersey, the biggest Hindu temple outside of India is in Robbinsville, New Jersey, Bap Swami Narayan. Now that temple does not let you worship icons anymore. They say they have thousands of little icons that are just carved in the walls behind lucite or plexiglass or whatever it's behind, and now you only worship in your mind. The Swami Narayan followers in New Jersey say you don't build a household shrine with statues anymore. You just do it in your mind. You need a mental icon, and therefore don't do it. And you certainly don't bring fruit and flowers and milk and honey anymore to pour over statues, which is also why they have to be changed regularly, is because now it's all done mentally with more singing in a much more American point of view. So to the other big change in England and New Jersey and in San Jose and elsewhere is the rise of Ganesh as a new temple, who is a minor temple in India, because now all Southerners have to pray in the same temple. Meaning when we all came here on the Lower East Side, you had Anshe Meseritz, you had the Bialystoker, everyone named their shul after the town you came from in Eastern Europe. But eventually you all had to merge. So too, the Hindu temples here in America are all merging basically into South versus Northern as two separate approaches. And that's also a major change. And a lot of the stuff that you would think, oh, but I saw this in the street, know that it's not going on in Edison, New Jersey. But on the other hand, the Edison, New Jersey, I mean, the temple in Robbinsville is very strict that they don't allow mixed dancing in their social hall. So therefore they have trouble renting it out for the more liberal Hindus to use their social hall. There's a certain, when I tell you that story, I can see some of you immediately smiling and understanding what this is about, because they are adapting and they are looking more and more like American religion. I'm going to close with telling you the fact that at any given time, there are 30 to 40,000 Israelis in India. They go after army and they stay there and they pick it up. And that's why you should know that a lot of meditation, yoga, and Indian thinking is now affecting the religious Zionist world. You know, some of you may have heard Rabbi Yaakov Nagain when he came through Teaneck, because he also talked quite a bit about it. A lot of the Ramim and the Hesder Yeshivot are going to India because they have to be where their students are. And I'm going to quote from the poetess Rivka Miriam. Those who don't know, she's a Dati poetess. Poet means she's a female religious poet. And she wrote a essay when she came back from India, and it's in a volume called Hodu V'Ad Khan, which is a collection of Dati religious perspectives on how India is affecting their religious life now that they move back to Israel. And she wrote, meeting divinity and its expression in India brought about a transformation in me. We Jews employ the common expression, there is no place devoid of him. Okay, it's everywhere in Kabbalah and Chassidut, no place devoid of him. In India, I discovered a world where indeed so it is. I discovered a world where there is no one who does not believe. I discovered a world where one sees divinity in every tree and every stone, but also in every deed and every matter. The entire world is full of his glory. Questions?
All right, here's a question.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Brill, so much.
Okay.
Did you feel welcomed and respected as a representative of Judaism while you were in India? And were they curious as to what Judaism's all about?
So to answer the first one first, so I always dressed like clergy, meaning I wore long sleeves and long pants. I didn't dress like, meaning, you know, you think an American go there, we wear shorts and a t-shirt. No, I wore long pants, long sleeves, and I always wore kippah. Every Hindu did not know what I was, whether I was some Islamic sect or I was a Farsi or whatever I was. But the fact that I wore a kippah and I dressed in long sleeves meant I was clergy. So I was definitely, you know, Guruji, and I was seen as a clergy person, and they gave me deep respect wherever I went. Know that the local Chabad in town was not in town for most of November, December. He only showed up in January, and all the tuk-tuk drivers, the go-kart drivers, told me that he's back in town. They didn't know enough about Judaism, but they knew in some way I'm connected to him. They were very, very respectful. In terms of their interest, so I taught graduate course of Buddhist and Hindu monks who thought the most wild meditation techniques and the wild Buddhist books were commonplace, but Judaism was exotic. So they were definitely anxious to learn, because from their point of view, they're now the experts. You know, some other faculty members sat in on my class on Judaism, taking copious notes, because they really had never really heard, they never heard about anything directly. Unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate, for better or worse, that almost the entire Jewish community left in 1949-50 during the Hindu-Muslim wars that created India-Pakistan. Jews did not know what the future was going to hold. You know, it's never safe to be a Jew during a major war in which millions are being killed. So the majority of Indian Jews moved to Israel. So it's a shame. So therefore, they don't see many Jews anymore, even though Jews had been in India since the time of Shlomo. Many of the words in Hashirim, the spices, the animals, are Tamil words. Tamil is the language of southern India, and therefore the ships between of Jews going back and forth had been there all the time. The Rambam's brother who died was a merchant in India and Indonesia. So, but they hadn't met real living Jews that could ask basic questions to.
Thank you.
Question. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You talked about monotheism and polytheism. What about the Kriya Shema?
You're muted.
Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Isn't that emphasis on monotheism?
So the answer is yes. They will all say God is one. What they're violating is they're violating representation. They're going to work. They're going to use every star, every moon, every animal, every tree, every stone as a way to come to the oneness.
Okay.
It's Asur, it's Avodah Zarah, but that doesn't mean they've got many gods.
Okay.
I mean, that's the point. There's nothing they won't use to worship. Any stone they like, any tree. I mean, if you were Hindu and you saw the Kotel, the first thing you would do is you put a little face on it so you could address it as a representation of God. Not that you think that the Kotel would be God, but that's the way they work. Anything they approach, they'll put a face on it, because that is the way they worship.
I wasn't asking about the Hindus. I was asking about the concept of monotheism versus polytheism being a Jewish idea.
Oh, no. So therefore, whatever Hashem Echad, the uniqueness, the oneness of God, meaning that there's one God and there's no other gods. It's denying the fact that there are many gods out there. But the idea that there's a polytheistic wasn't invented yet.
Okay.
It's a longer story about how ancient worked, but the point is there was not the God of Moab and the God of Ammon and the God of the Pelishtim. We denied all that when we say Shema.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there a common set of beliefs that a good Hindu must subscribe to? Like we have core beliefs?
So every religion has their own. The Shaivites have their list, the Vaishnavites have their list. So the Indian Constitution has to bend over, defining a Hindu as a religion that's not Jewish, not Christian, not Muslim, not Farsi, that respects the following items, that has no objection to imagery, that meaning because there are so many variants.
So there's nothing in common that they all have in terms of belief.
There's a commonality. There's a commonality, but nothing that can be simplified that there won't be tens of millions of exceptions to. That's the problem. That's the way they work, is that there's so many, they're the most populous place on earth and we're a small little nation. They have so many exceptions to the rule. So there's a general list of meaning the books that came out that you may have used in college or came out 50, 60 years ago tried to make such a list, but it's not, then they're not really what any Hindu actually believes. They have a huge variety. of a general sense of we accept the following scriptures in the following forms, even though there's many, many multiple versions. Or to put it in how different it is, we have one Tanakh, we have one Chumash. They've got more than a dozen. Because the way they grew is imagine if we saying Moab and Ammon and the Hittites were separate religions. Imagine if we said, well, we're all really one. We all, Ammon and Moab, we speak basically the same language and we're all descendant from each other. And you, Ugaritic, and the Hittites, you're also just a dialect of Hebrew. We're all really one. And therefore we're going to incorporate all of your scriptures into our big religion, even though there's differences. They're very inclusive in the way they think, in a way that makes it very hard to pin them down.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are any specific meditative techniques that you learned during this trip that you feel that you took back with you that you feel can be integrated into our approach to Jewish prayer and performance of Jewish ritual?
So there's more than one thing in that question. The most important thing you take is you see how important meditation is in the various schools of Kashmir Shaivism, yoga, and how it's important in the various schools, and for us to take it seriously within our own tradition, meaning we don't have to take theirs as much as learning to come back appreciative. And so therefore, whether Rav Nagain or Ra'ema Cohen at Otniel or elsewhere, they're coming back and saying, if we don't show them ours after they come back from India, because what they really want is meditation, they don't need a specific Indian technique. What you do learn specifically is you learn a certain language that we're just not used to using. But like I said, we've got quite a bit. The other thing is also how to modernize it. What I did learn is that most of the Indian techniques that you will learn in America came from Swami Vivekananda, who is the Hindu representative at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. But when you go back and see what he taught and what he took it from, basically he took these complex Kabbalistic Hindu texts that nobody could ever really read except a true scholar, and he basically picked it out and simplified it in English into a how-to. So too you learn that if you're going to take the Arei or you're going to take the Tikkun Zohar, whatever you're going to take, don't start teaching people the medieval Kabbalah. Put it into nice English sentences rather than teaching people the obscure Aramaic, which is exactly what Swami Vivekananda did, which is a more important lesson than any technique. Any other questions? Since can't see everyone, hold on. Any other questions here?
Okay. And if there aren't any other questions, then I want to thank you again on behalf of the shul, on behalf of B'nai Yeshurun and everyone else joining us from other, congregations in town. Thank you so much for this very informative and inspiring lecture. It really leaves us with a lot to think about, and we really, really appreciate you sharing your time and your wisdom with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Before
Bye.
everyone logs out, I just would like you all to invite everyone to join us Thursday night for another wonderful program that we have planned with TNEC's Ilana Kaplan, who will take us on a virtual museum tour exploring Passover related art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So please meet us back here for that 8:15.
I must point out that my book, Rabbi on the Ganges, will be out in paperback in about 60 days. It's in hardcover,
great.
but the paperback is on its way.
Can we find you on TNEC for autographed copies?
Yes.
Okay. That would be great.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.